Great. So, hello everybody, and thanks ever so much for coming to our event, Reimagining Accountability in Local Government. My name is Fanny. I'm part of Research for Action, which is organising this event. We're a small workers' co-op that produces research to further social, economic and environmental justice. Our biggest project for a number of years now has been a citizen audit of local authority debt. And we've supported people, local residents, to try and hold their councils to account over spending that they don't believe is in the public interest. And I'm going to speak a bit more about that before our amazing guest speakers in a minute. But just a couple of other introductions. We have Megan on the call. Megan, give a wave. She co-authored our recent report on accountability rights in local government, and is actually a PhD researcher from the University of Leeds. Well, actually, also, I should say. We kind of have different hats, Research for Action and University. And then behind the Research for Action Zoom account is Steve. Steve, give a wave, who occasionally helps us out and is running our tech infrastructure today. So if you have any problems, just you can drop Steve a message in the private message in the chat. And yeah, we're really excited to have such a great lineup of speakers. We have Jess Hall, who is the director of Shared Future Community Interest Company. Then we have Andy Paice, who's a facilitator of many things, I understand, but capacity he's speaking at today is a facilitator of citizen assemblies. Then we have Nirushan Sudarsan from a campaign group called Butetown Matters, and Rebekah McCabe from Involve. And I'll tell you a bit more about each speaker before they speak. They'll each speak for about 12 minutes, after which we will open the floor for questions. And just to structure the conversation a bit, we'll start with direct questions to the speakers, and then the last sort of bit of time that we have together, we will move on to a wider discussion. So if you have sort of experiences of these processes, anything that you want to share, hold the sort of thoughts to the final bit of the conversation, but we'll obviously talk you through all these practicalities sort of as they come up. I'll pass on to Megan for a couple of practicalities first, so that you don't only have to listen to me too much.
Okay, thank you, Fanny. Yeah, I'm just going to talk through a couple of housekeeping points, Zoom housekeeping points. If you've just joined, we're going to be recording this event to post on our website at a later date. So if you don't want to appear on the recording, you're of course welcome to keep the camera off. And if you've got any questions or contributions, just post them in the chat. And obviously keep using the chat as we go through for any questions or making links with people generally. The recording, which will go up on the website, will also include slides from the presentations that you see. And if you want to save the chat or download the chat before you go, there's a little icon at the bottom right hand corner of the chat box, and you just click on save, and that will save it all. So if we can ask that you please remain on mute until the speakers have finished. As Fanny said, there will be time for Q&A afterwards, but obviously you can post questions in the chat box as you're listening by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen. And it would be really helpful for us if you could indicate that it's a question with a big Q at the start. That will make it easier for me to spot the questions and pull them out from the general comments. So this event is our second webinar this spring. Our work, as Fanny said, has mainly focused on accountability in terms of scrutinising council spending. And our first webinar brought together citizen auditors, researchers and journalists to discuss on a practical level how councils can be scrutinised. And on the 7th of June, we'll be hosting a round table with experts on audit failure to focus on how auditing and local government could be improved. There's much more detail about our most recent work in the report that came out a few weeks ago, Democracy Denied, Audit and Accountability, Failure in Local Government, and that's available on our website. And I think Steve is getting ready to post a link in the chat. But with this event, what we wanted to do is broaden out our discussion and think about possibilities beyond just scrutinizing decisions after they've been made. So what if we actually looked at involving people and engaging with public bodies and decision making right from the start? And when we do that, what barriers are there for everyone's voices being heard and being listened to? After all, many of the problems we've seen in local government stem from a wider lack of democracy. And excitingly, there's a growing current of people and groups getting interested in local democracy, both in the UK and globally. So what we're hoping today will do is give us a chance to hear about solutions rather than just focusing on problems. And hopefully we'll all learn something new and get inspiration for our campaigning, advocacy, or whatever work we're doing in this space. It's also a chance to discuss what these different participatory practices offer in terms of accountability, how they can improve it, but also how these different democratic processes can be made more accountable, and how local authorities can do better at including and hearing everyone's voices. Before we move on and hear from the amazing speakers that we've got today, we thought it would be good to do a poll and get a sense of who's in the room. And oh, hold on a second. So that's coming up now. Who and what experience people have of participation in local democracy. So you should see that on your screens now. And unless you're taking part in this on a phone or a pad, you should be able to click. So, or unless you're a co-host, you can't. Okay, so it looks like nearly everyone who can take part. Fanny, in order to show this, do I press end polling?
Yes, end polling.
Is that automatic?
People are also commenting in the chat. Richard's saying, looks like we only click on one. Sorry about that. That's an unfortunate, yeah, just a technical thing then. And then there's an other as a council officer in the chat as well. Somebody said an option that there wasn't.
Okay. Hold on a second. So from what I'm seeing, it looks like we have a lot of experience in the room around campaigning around local issues, which is really brilliant that we've got so much experience in the room. Should make for some really interesting questions and discussion. I'm going to pass back to Fanny now, who's going to tell you about the citizen audits that informed our recent report and the absence of accountability around local government spending that we came up against, but also they'll share some of the positive impacts that have come out of the process that we've been through.
Great. Thanks very much, Megan. I will share my presentation. I hope you can see my screen. Cool. Steve, Megan, can you give me a thumbs up? It's all good. Sharing, great. So yeah, I'm not going to speak for too long, but just wanted to give you a little bit of context into where we are coming from as Research for Action and what citizen audits are. So there's different types of citizens audits. I'm definitely not claiming that what we have done is a kind of representative of everything that could be done in this space, but generally citizen audits are a collective sort of process that aims to investigate what's going on with public spending, usually with a certain focus of something that the public, people get together and want to know a bit more about. And there's definitely always the kind of side of holding decision makers to account. It's not just about accessing information and creating sort of demanding more transparency. It's also about creating a kind of new forms of accountability where we actually, as just ordinary people, can exercise our rights to get information. And there's a sort of technical side to citizen audits, but it's always definitely also kind of mainly almost a sort of educational campaign where people can learn from each other, share knowledge, intends to have a sort of broader impact than just on the exact issue that it's zooming on. In a minute, I will talk about a couple of examples that we have done. Just to say that I always find it, especially in the current sort of austerity era, it's always super important to say that citizen audits are not about this kind of vision that the coalition government had for big society. And when they abolished the audit commission, they kind of were talking about this army of armchair auditors rising up and scrutinizing their council spending. That's not where we're coming from. We're more coming from like building collective power and new forms of accountability. Our work massively stands on the shoulders of people who have been doing citizen audits for decades and demanding them, especially in the global south after the 80s debt crisis. That's kind of, those debt audits campaigns are our sort of nearest point of reference, but there are definitely other forms of citizen audits too. And just to give you an idea what can be done and what we have done research for action together with a group called Debt Resistance UK, sort of zoomed in on toxic long-term loans that many, like hundreds of councils in the UK had taken out. They're called LOBO loans, and we supported residents to file objections to them, working together with local campaigners to sort of debunk the argument that there's no money for public spending and cuts need to be made if at the same time tens of millions of pounds were flowing to banks in interest payments. We also had a relationship to financial experts who sort of helped behind the scenes to understand, because these loans were really quite technical, contained derivatives, a lot of sort of really obscure stuff. But we also worked together with councillors, backbench councillors, created media coverage, reached out quite widely, interviewed residents about the impact of service cuts to argue that LOBO debt was illegitimate. Especially, we focused on the borough of Newham in East London, which was the biggest LOBO borough and also hosted the Olympics 2012. Then Megan has been involved in a PFI safety audit. PFI, Private Finance Initiative, is basically a public-private partnership model of delivering public buildings through the private sector really expensively. There's thousands of public buildings delivered through PFI, which cost the public purse £10 billion a year. And the People versus PFI group, basically, it was a group of public sector workers, health and debt campaigners, academics, unions that came together to sort of expose the unaffordability of PFI and how many of the buildings are actually really unsafe and the whole process is really obscure. So they made extensive use of freedom of information requests to show how profits were being extracted to private companies. There were conflicts of interest around consultants and auditors, and a lot of these buildings, like I said, had really severe safety failings, and that's where the safety audit of PFI kind of then came about in terms of supporting residents to object to PFI projects in their local areas. They also created media coverage and created a sort of photo exhibition of PFI, but also members of the campaign developed a proposal how PFI could actually be nationalised. And just, I wanted to say a couple of words about what impact both of these audits have had on the LOBO front. 8 councils actually took Barclays Bank to court over local loans. The judge really recently threw the case out of court, but one council, Newham, is appealing the ruling. But Royal Bank of Scotland has allowed councils to exit early some of the most toxic loans. And there was also in 2015, following a Channel 4 Dispatches documentary, a parliamentary inquiry, but unfortunately that was then dropped. There on PFI, there has also been an independent inquiry following the work of People versus PFI and the media coverage that they have created. They also pressured Camden Council to bring their housing PFI back in-house following safety concerns. And yeah, temporarily, the Labour Party in 2017 adopted a demand to nationalise all PFI projects. Like I said, we're by no means the only people doing this work. In South London, in Lambeth, there's a group called People's Audit who have done amazing work scrutinising their local council spending since 2015. Also, the Journalist Network Bureau Local made collective use of the right to inspect council accounts in 2019. And there's also a wide network of individuals who are scrutinising their council spending. And like I said, there's also international connections. We were inspired greatly by the citizen-led audit platform that was created in many, many cities across the Spanish states after the 2011 big democracy protests. So I just wanted to make you aware of the rights that we have used under the Local Audit and Accountability Act. Residents have the right to inspect council accounts, ask the auditor a question about the accounts, and object to spending they believe is not in the public interest or could be unlawful. The inspection right actually applies more broadly than just to residents. So basically, when the council publishes its draft accounts around this time of the year, they then have to publish a public notice for the inspection period, which is usually in the summer, depends on which nation in the UK it is. This year it's actually been pushed back because of COVID. But it is really quite a powerful sort of tool for holding council's account, or has the potential to be, because as a result of objections, you can ask the auditor of the council to actually refer something to the High Court and possibly be cancelled. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that happen. On our website, there's a guide into the rights that I've just mentioned. And then I just want to say that, like Steve's already posted in chat and Megan's already mentioned, we recently published a report where we analysed lots of uses of these rights, objections and inspections to council accounts in England and Scotland. And our findings actually show that, yeah, these rights are really not fit for purpose to holding councils to account, which is partly why we are now kind of having this broader conversation about what else should be done and what else could be done. Yeah, follow us on Twitter, read our latest report. Like I said, the link has been also posted in the chat, so no need to scribble it down from there. And there's our email addresses if you want to get in touch. So thank you very much for listening to that. I will now pass on to the people you have actually come to here today, who are our amazing guest speakers. Jess will start. Jess Hall is an expert on participatory budgeting, big time expert. He's got over 25 years of experience of facilitating deliberative and participatory democracy processes, delivering research and policy work. He has been on the advisory board of the North American Participatory Budgeting Project. He occasionally works as a consultant to the World Bank, and he coordinates the UK PB Network website. Also founding director of the community interest company Shared Future, and has written a lot of different kinds of publications on these processes. So I'll pass on to you, Jess.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm going to just put my screen share up now, so there'll be a moment before I get into full fluidity as such, and I hope everyone can see that on their screens now. I am, as I said, Director of Shared Future CIC, and the topic I'm talking about today is participatory budgeting. Not sure how much people might know of that. I know a few people here know a little bit, and really it's about, I think, this good phrase, the search for shared meanings, and I'll get into what I mean about that a little bit later on. Just wanted to start really with this saying, which I picked up off Twitter a while ago, and I just keep coming back to it. And it's the truth about his city's aspiration isn't found in its vision, it's found in its budget. It's when actually we turn all of that talking and planning into pounds and pence that power is really exhibited within our system. And having looked at this world for like 20 years, as Fanny said, I still don't understand most of the finances. So if I don't, and I've been really trying to, then what chance do ordinary citizens have to influence it? So participatory budgeting is really a process of participatory democracy to bring citizens closer to the public budget. So here's a definition from the World Bank. Participatory budgeting, I'm going to keep calling it PB, is a process through which citizens participate directly in budget formulation, that's making budgets, decision making, that's deciding how money is spent, and monitoring of budget execution, so working out what's actually happened. And it creates a channels for citizens to give voice to their budget priorities. So that was said by the World Bank. I quite like this one that said, from Brazil, though, where PB started, if it feels like we've decided it's PB, and if it feels like someone else has decided it isn't. So it's very much about, do we feel we have power, agency, voice when our tax money, because ultimately most of the money is in some level derived from our taxes, or at least our taxes go to pay the debts that councils and other bodies take on our behalf. There's some characteristics here. I'm not going to go into all of this in great depth, but this came from a consultant from the World Bank who I worked with some time. So it's about public budgets. It's about real money. So it's about spending real money. It's about having a direct impact on that. So it's not just a consultation or an engagement, a budget meeting or something like that. It should, at its best principle, be co-designed, so citizens should be able to shape the rules by which it operates. And it's got a deliberative element. It's more than just voting for projects you like or projects you don't, against projects you don't like. It's actually bringing people to think through different options, meet with people and come up with better solutions to how to spend limited resources. Ideally, redistribution is embedded in the process, so it promotes equity and equality among citizens. And there's a critical aspect that citizens should be able to monitor public spending. I think that's where it gets close to the work that Research for Action does. And also, hopefully, it's repeated. So it happens more than once, and through that cyclical process, it grows and develops over time. A bit of a warning, we're not talking about abolishing representative democracy and putting all of the public budget into some sort of open process. It's about a small percentage of the overall public budget is allocated using PB, where citizens directly decide how that money is spent. But through engaging with that small part of the budget, what we hope and what we seem to see is that people become interested in the wider budget and are actually beginning to start to chase down information. PB is a process which has got governance built into it. So it's always mandated and signed off by the elected body. In principle, there should be a process that's agreed and defined and a budget set aside for citizens to make a decision on. And ideally, it supports representative democracy. It's participatory democracy working alongside it. It's about improving and reforming how public money is spent, and it's about building stronger communities. What we see often through these PB processes, I'm not going to go into much of the detail how they run, is that people start to realize that they have resources and assets within their communities already, and they start to cooperate and collaborate around the process. It began in Brazil in the 1980s at a period when they were coming out of military rule, and there was a lot of corruption, there was a lot of criticism, there was a lot of austerity, there was a lot of pent-up need within the system. And I think it's interesting to reflect that that's not so dissimilar to the situation we are in now, where there's a sort of crisis of democracy. Since the 1980s, it's been spreading across the world. So the Participatory Budgeting World Atlas in 2019 identified 11,000 different experiences globally over the last 20 to 25 years. And it's been identified by major global institutions as a practice of a good practice. So the World Bank's been mentioned, UNESCO, the OECD, Organisation of Economic something or other development, UN Habitat, which is about cities and the future of cities, and our own Department of International Development have all praised it. It's based on this kind of principle, what you might call subsidiarity. So that is that decisions, should be made at the lowest authority, lowest competent level. So you should be devolving power wherever possible. I'm just going to move something on my screen because the little box has gone in the wrong place. So it's spread from Brazil into Latin America, into Europe in around 2000. So Spain, Germany and Italy led some of those early experiences. Portugal has really embraced it over the last few years. There's 30 plus programs at any one time going on in Portugal, slowed down a bit under COVID, but still happening. And they have a national PB program as well. So they use PB to engage people in conversations around the national budget of Portugal. And for example, the Lisbon has a $6 million US, that's about £5 million, green PB. So they've got a thematic PB around climate change, helping people to get involved in thinking through ways that the local authority, the city council can tackle that intractable problem. Paris has got $100 million a year, has been spent over many years. So that's 5% of the capital budget. So that's very big. But what we do know is that quite often projects start and then fade away. So that's a critical challenge within these processes. Chicago, just a few more, began with the $1 million, but that grew. So New York has taken it on. It's grown up to $45 million in New York. And in the city of Boston, another thematic PB, they give $1 million a year to young people to come up with proposals to spend money on making it a better city. So they kind of connect people into citizenship, work, civic education, lots of other stuff. And it's happened in many different places for many different reasons. The critical issue is that it varies hugely in scale. It varies depending on the context, and it varies based on its radicalism. So what are we trying to achieve through this? And it's just really interesting under the Black Lives Matter after George Floyd's murder last year, that Black Lives Matter have been using PB as part of the defund the police campaigns in the USA. So quite radical there. In Scotland, it's been happening for about the last 5 years. It began with some interest in it as a mechanism for sort of rebuilding a concept of citizenship, and the Commission on Local Democracy basically said the best people to decide the future of our communities are the people who live in those communities. And over the last 5 years, there's been considerable investment in Scotland in developing a Scottish PB network with lots of interesting case studies. And the journey really started, as I said, in 2015 with the Community Empowerment Act. Then it led through to an agreement between the Scottish Government and COSLA, which is the equivalent of the LGA in England, that 1% of government budgets will be subject to PB by 2020, which doesn't sound much, 1%, but it actually adds up to 100 million across the whole of Scotland per year. So that's a considerable amount of money. And the point is, it's that 1% is like a sort of Trojan horse. It starts to open up conversations around the other 99%. In Scotland, they put a lot of work into developing the equalities framework to make sure that everybody can understand and participate in these processes. But they've also developed a charter, so a whole set of values that underpin PB so that citizens can hold these processes to account as well, and that they basically try to improve practice over time. So within PB, I've just mentioned values. I think transparency and accountability always feature very high in the values of PB, but it's not enough in themselves. It also includes, generally, and the Scottish one does, issues around inclusion and participation. And it's quite interesting. I felt when I looked at, for preparing for this, I looked at some early academic work from about 2015 on Edinburgh's participatory budgeting process, and they identified different levels of transparency. So at one level, access to information is an important part of transparency. But the second level of transparency is when there is a general level of understanding of the phenomena. So do people not only have access to information, but do they understand that information? And then the third level of transparency, which is around shared meaning. So are there shared meanings around budgeting developing between citizens and between public officials and accountants and auditors? And I think that technical language of budgets is one of its biggest problems as such. I'm probably getting close to my time, but I haven't got too many more now. But what they did find in that study in Edinburgh is where citizens connected with the idea, these initiatives enhance democratic accountability and transparency in public finances, and the wider adoption of PB offers a route for shifting from the traditional backward-looking silo approach to budgeting to a more participatory approach, which should achieve greater transparency and enhance democratic accountability. Got 2 or 3 more minutes, I hope, and then I'll finish. Little cycle. Anytime you spend money, you go through a process, whether that's designing, engaging, informing, setting priorities, developing ideas for investments, the decision making. You actually deliver those projects, and then there's scrutiny and monitoring and the evaluation and learning. So that's a budget cycle, and a lot of the work of Research for Action is around that scrutiny and monitoring. And the challenge of PB is saying, can we actually open up dialogue at all points in that process? Here's a little example. In Brazil, many years ago, when they were doing PB, the annual budget book of the Porto Alegre became the second most taken out volume within the public libraries in Brazil. Lots of people became very interested in budgets. And this is just a little on the side of a building in one city in Brazil, where they basically put down the expenditure and the income for the local authority. And it says on the left where the money comes from, on the right where the money is spent. And when the administration is transparent, everything works smoothly across the bottom. So that's the open government bit. So just to summarize, some of the evidence benefits from PB, as I said, it's a global phenomenon, it's been well researched, is better alignment between the needs of citizens and public sector investment, high levels of public participation, thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people participate in Paris as PB processes, reductions in inequality, it's been seen to be pro-poor, increased tax revenue. So where PB has happened, there is evidence that people are more willing to pay tax. Well, that shows that they're beginning to trust government. Improved democratic performance, more people vote, more people get involved in the political process, they feel it's about them. And we've also seen that it can have some benefits in reducing conflict between groups who are bidding for resources through the process of engagement that happens within PB. And then just to finish off, it's really important, if you're going to do this, that there is a convincing story to tell, both for politicians, what benefit will they get from this? For public officials, why would PB actually help their work of running local authorities and councils and communities? But also there has to be something in it for citizens. So it has to be fun and engaging and accessible. So how will it benefit you is the challenge question. So that's all my presentations. I'm sorry if I've gone a little bit over. And obviously, if you want, I'll be able to get you these slides. I'll stop my share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jess. You only men. but went over by about a minute and a half, so I didn't want to budge in. That was all, yeah, just really, really interesting and inspiring to hear. Next, we have Andy Paice, who's a London-based facilitator working with leading participation organisations, delivering and designing participatory, digital and deliberative democracy projects. So he has since 2018 facilitated and co-designed several citizen assemblies and citizen juries in different regions of the UK. And his work is based on the conviction that with the right processes and conditions, groups and communities can work through conflict and difference to find wise and mutually beneficial solutions. So Andy's gonna tell us about citizen assemblies now.
Thanks, Fanny, and thanks to Research for Action for putting on this event. It's great to be here. So yeah, I'm not sure how many of you already have an idea of what citizens' assemblies are. So I'm sort of going to pitch to the basics and go through some of the aspects of what's involved. So basically, as an overview, they're a radically different way of doing democracy that's not based on party politics, elections, or voting on sort of particular manifestos. It's a much more relational process, and it's about people coming together to discuss and deliberate on important issues. So going to start off, I'm going to share my screen. The first question is around, who gets to participate in a citizens' assembly? Well, let's see. I've got the share button here. See that? So the answer is, it's not like a town hall event where people turn, where you may be invited to come along and anybody who's interested can turn up. Citizens' assemblies are run on the principle of random selection or sortition. And so it's a bit like, another word for this is a civic lottery. So a number of letters are sent out, invitation letters that go out to a particular locality. There's usually an organization, independent organization that's brought in to do this work, and they will send out to a large number of local citizens, and it will be completely random. It will be sent out by raw mail using electoral roll and sent out to households. And there'll be an invitation to come along to this assembly. And there'll be the promise of some sort of reward for the time as well that people are going to spend, and usually some sort of monetary reward. And yeah, people can sign up. They go onto a website or go to a free phone number where they can register, and they're asked a number of questions. And those questions are used to do something that's called a stratification process. So an important principle of citizens' assemblies is that the citizens in the assembly are broadly representative of the demographic makeup of a given area. So when people say they're interested in coming along to this assembly, that doesn't automatically mean that they can be part of it. They go into a pool, and on a given date, there is a selection process that takes place. And there'll be a sort of a software algorithm that selects people and matches the different numbers according to the different criteria that they filled in when they had their questions. So as you can see here, I don't know if you can see that clearly enough, but there are different criteria here: gender, age, geography, where people live in a given area, their occupation. This was for a climate assembly in Newham, so they were asking people about their concern level on climate change, were they concerned or not concerned, and also on ethnicity. So here are the figures that show the representation coming from census figures. And the second column shows the respondents, the people that actually responded. So we can see that there's a lot more of certain categories that responded than would be the average for the demographic makeup. But in order to balance things out, this algorithm creates a selection of the local people that will match the census figures here. So this was for this climate change assembly in Newham, and that's shows all that how that works. So yeah, so you end up with a number of citizens. For something, citizens assemblies and citizens juries are pretty much the same kind of process. It just differs in number. So usually with a citizens jury, you may have 15 to 40 participants, and citizens assemblies are usually sort of anything 40, 50 up to 100, or even, can be even more. So, okay, so that's how you get to be part of a citizens assembly. So what actually happens in a citizens assembly? So residents are brought together to consider what should be done on a given issue. It's usually good if this issue is a sort of quite a thorny issue, an intractable one. Although, you know, these processes can be quite expensive. So going through this whole process is good to work on an issue that maybe has difficulty being resolved at a political level, or is just incredibly complex and requires the sort of knowledge and understanding of the lived experience and the input of different stakeholders. So yeah, complex issues like climate change as well. So once people have come along to an assembly, they go through, first of all, a learning stage, and they hear from evidence from a number of expert witnesses and commentators. Could also be particular stakeholders who are connected to the issue. And they sometimes listen to very technical information, and they have time to really listen to it, make notes, and then in small groups get to discuss what they've heard. And they have time to think and also to ask questions. So, you know, sometimes you have large group Q&As, sometimes there are smaller group question and answer sessions with the experts themselves. And this whole process is facilitated by a number of facilitators. Usually small group discussions take place with one facilitator to sort of 7 to 9 to 10 participants. And so, yeah, first of all, there's this learning stage, listening to a variety of speakers on a subject. And then the next stage is this deliberation stage where they're weighing up different trade-offs, starting to think about recommendations, and starting then to go into a process of prioritizing their ideas collectively and drafting the recommendations. And then the final stage is where these recommendations are sort of written up with the help of facilitators. It's all really done by the citizens themselves, so that what is produced is coming from them and not, you know, it's not the experts, it's not the politicians, it's very much the citizens themselves that are making these sort of final judgments. And usually these recommendations end up going to a final vote, and then those recommendations are handed over to the commissioning body to be responded on. A few things here. I'm just going to stop the share for a second. So some of the principles about citizens' assemblies. Yeah, one principle is diversity, inclusivity. They have to sort of represent the wider population, given that they've been selected at random. They're deliberative, so it's not like democracy where we're voting at a ballot box and simply voting on any sort of slogans or ideas that we might have just heard on social media. It's really going through a process of being informed. It's not their sort of top of the head opinions, but going into deeper, much more considered judgments by weighing up lots of different arguments, looking at lots of different information. They're also lengthy. They last at least 4 days. So I think there's been a series of standards that's been created recently by UK practitioners of deliberative democracy that was being sort of convened by Involve UK. And they have made up a series of standards. One of them is that, you know, it should at least be around 30 hours because in order to come up with proper recommendations and real considered decisions, you need time. Yeah, and then obviously, as I said, they're by the recommendations that come out of it are by the people, for the people. They're not made by politicians or officers. They're published afterwards in a report without any revision, caveat, or manipulation. And there should be, if the process is done properly and legitimately, some kind of formal response by the decision makers at the end. So, yeah, so quite often there should be some kind of publication or a launch event where the authority, the government or local government says, okay, here are the recommendations and here's what we can do, here's what we're going to implement, and this XYZ we may not be able to do, but to give reasons why. So there's that aspect of transparency, accountability in that. And also the whole process as well, if it's done correctly, should be very transparent. So there's often a microsite with all of the speakers' videos posted, and a list of people who are also on an advisory board. So there's usually a group that comes together to recommend who the speakers should be and to oversee the whole process. So a list of who they are will also be on the website and how the whole process is being undertaken. Yeah, so as I said, these assemblies have taken place on different themes. It's good if they can tackle thorny questions that that the government or the politicians may find difficult to implement themselves. So recently there've been a large number, so since 2019, I think in the UK, citizens' assemblies have pretty much exploded. You know, there've been a large number of climate assemblies. So there's been climate assemblies that have taken place in Brent, Oxford, Durham, Worthing, Brighton, Camden, Newham, north of Tyne, Lancaster, Kendal, Warwick, Devon. There's a long list, and they're continuing to take place. I think one of the reasons why there have been a lot of climate assemblies is because of the activism of Extinction Rebellion that have gone to local councils and have pushed councils, you know, that have already declared a climate emergency and saying, okay, well, you know, you've declared a climate emergency, now what? And recognizing that there needs to be some interaction with the local population in order to tackle it effectively. Another significant thing that has sort of made citizens' assemblies very popular in the UK is the Innovations in Democracy programme. That's a programme that was set up by the UK government, by the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And they set up 3 different sort of pilot projects around the UK. One in Dudley on the future of town centres, in Cambridge on improving public transport, tackling congestion, and another one, I think, sort of a very hyper-local assembly in the Test Valley Borough Council on how to, I really like this one because it's really very localised. How do we improve the area around Crossfield Hall and the bus station to deliver the maximum benefit to Romsey? So yeah, other subjects that they've dealt with in Jersey currently: assisted dying, Waltham Forest on hate crime, Bristol on rebuilding the city following the effects of COVID-19. There's been a UK-wide on social care. There's been one on the future of democracy in Wales. So, you know, they're really taking off in the UK. Why is this? What's good about them? Well, I don't know. How am I doing on time? Am I?
You are kind of out of time. So should we save that for the discussion?
Yeah, we'll save for the discussion.
Yeah, great. Thanks ever so much, Andy. That's really great to hear about all those processes and how they actually happen. I didn't really know all that detail about the details of the algorithms behind the sortation. But let's move on and move into the world of campaigning next, because despite all the great potential that there is in what local authorities can do, it's as important to remember that the reality in a lot of places is that many people and many communities don't really get listened to, even when they join forces to really try and influence decision making. And we need to keep those challenges in the conversation to avoid replicating some of the power structures that are causing the current democratic deficit. So we have Nirushan Sudarsan here from Butetown Matters, which is a network of young leaders passionate about their communities. They're using social media, stories, and campaigning to raise awareness and amplify issues and to share positive stories. They are run by the community for the community. And Nirushan will tell you more.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fanny, for that introduction. And hi, everyone. Really great presentation so far. I thought I'll start off by telling you a bit of Cardiff. Actually, not me. I'm going to show you a video because, you know, we don't want to be sitting for 12 minutes just listening to my voice. So I thought an exciting video would do the trick. So this is the video about the area I'm going to be talking about in the campaign later. It talks about Butetown, which is in the southern part of the city of Cardiff, and it's mostly diverse communities that have been here for more than 100 years, and really tells the stories of multicultural communities coming together and living together. I'm just going to play this video. By the way, since I share my screen, I might not be able to see you. So if you can't hear, please do just shout. And then, yeah, I should be able to know that you can't hear it. So let me just share my screen and share sound, and I'll play this video.
I'm Mo Jana, and when I first came down to Wales 14 years ago, I expected to see the beautiful views, castles, sheep. Black people? No sir. So you can imagine my surprise when I found a vibrant community with deep roots.
To understand Wales's black history, you have to start right at the beginning of the history of the capital city, Cardiff.
The first cargo of coal to leave Cardiff was sent to the small islands of Cape Verde. Amazingly, as early as the 17th century, Cape Verdeans had begun to arrive in Cardiff.
Leroy Brittle is a comedian from Butetown whose family history stretches all the way back to the very beginning of the story.
My great-grandfather Pedro moved over here in 1912, and there was already an established Cape Verdean community within Tiger Bay. The first seamen over here were Cape Verdeans.
How's that feel?
Yeah, it's great. It's good to know that we've got just that footing within Butetown, within Tiger Bay, where it's just part of the blood and the heritage here.
The busiest coal port in the world in the second half of the 19th century and right up to the First World War. The sailors came in from all over the world. Arabs, Lascars, Africans, Chinese, West Indian, and a host of European nations.
Cardiff exploded from insignificance to a city known across the world.
Seamen from across the globe came here to the Welsh Docklands. Many of them settled, marrying local Welsh women from the South Wales valleys and beyond.
Denise and Frank Bridgman are long-standing Butetown residents. Denise's grandfather was West African and docked in Cardiff in the early 1900s.
My grandmother were white, both my grandfather were African, and they instilled in them the beauty of everything. So we've got no barriers. We can mix with the white people, we can mix with the black people, we can mix with anyone. I'm just so proud of my black African grandfather, and I'm just as proud as my white English grandmother.
A distinctive culture forged Tiger Bay, which was at odds with the British way of life. And in 1919, it kicked off in a big way.
When the war ended, white seamen were demobbed to find a housing shortage and a job shortage, with wealthy coloured seamen settled in.
In 1919, race riots brought murder, looting and chaos to the streets of Cardiff, the real low point in Wales's history.
Black lives in Wales should be celebrated, but we can't pretend that everything is perfect. This area of Butetown has often been misunderstood by those outside.
In the 60s, the stunning architecture of the docks community was lost forever. Every last brick was bulldozed, and in its place, a tower block of flats. The Tiger Bay spirit was almost lost. Karen Battle, the granddaughter of the famed Butetown musician Vic Parker, remembers what it was like to be brought up in this unique place.
We were cared for, we were loved by a community, not only mum and dad and grandma, the whole community, and that's lovely. I always feel that it's unique, you know. Martin Luther King was asking for, you're already out of here.
And here we are today in 2019.
The community is still here, still fighting for opportunity, still reaching for the stars.
Ruel Elijah is a musical trailblazer from Cardiff with big ambitions. Aged just 23, he's already taken the Street Dance Collective jukebox around the world.
My thing always throughout my whole life, and it's always a song in my heart, is be undeniable. So it doesn't matter, I could be black, brown, yellow, blue, but that boy's talented. That boy can sing, that boy can dance.
1, 2, 3, 4.
It is a dance platform, but it's emerged now into a performance platform, a talent agency. All of those kids, they don't even know they got that talent. So we kind of like pull it out of them, and then before you know it, they found their voice. And I think that's what it's about, and it gives them the confidence. So it starts with the dance, but you know, the confidence can take you anywhere.
The achievements of Black Welsh people in the face of discrimination are truly remarkable. One thing seems very clear to me as we celebrate Black History Month here in Wales.
This is Black Wales.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and it was a nice change to our presentation. But yeah, so that gives you a bit of background in what Butetown is and what kind of like a city.
36 years to win a sprint medal when she won silver at the 100.
Every time I play that video, the next video always plays. So I always forget to close it. So I think the next video is about Diane Abbott talking about some Black history athlete and her achievements. But we'll leave that for another time. So what I'm here to tell you about is Butetown and the campaign that we had with the paddle steamer. So as you saw, you know, it's a very multicultural community, but has lost lots of its architecture and cultural institutions in the last few decades. So in the past 20 years, Cardiff Bay and the area around Butetown has been redeveloped to attract tourists, attract people, and, you know, make it a much more appealing part of the city. What that has meant is, you know, communities have felt left out of that process. Butetown, you know, has a divide between the Bay, the wealthier part of the city, where, you know, lots of institutions such as the Wales Millennium Centre, the Welsh Parliament, and others in the city centre and in the Bay. Lots of major redevelopment, major businesses moving in. But, you know, you don't see the local communities reflected there or in other spaces in the city centre. What has that left is isolated this community, and, you know, more and more of the spaces that feels and belongs to the community is being lost. And, you know, we saw this happen again last year when we heard news of the paddle steamer being considered to be demolished to make way for social housing. And there's two things that are quite important to this issue. One is that we are all for social housing. You know, Butetown and the city of Cardiff is in high demand for social housing, and people need homes to move into. And number two, we were trying to say and communicate our message in saying, like, we respect that, we want this social housing, and we really want to make sure that we work with local authorities to ensure that happens. Now, what we didn't agree with, and this is where the campaign started, is that the cafe was being, as a result, a collateral damage to make for social housing. And, you know, communities can have cultural institutions that matter to communities such as Butetown and have social housing at the same time. You know, having that cross-collaborative approach between community members and leaders and the local authority to come to a compromise and solution where, you know, we can work together to address these problems. So, you know, we spoke with the owner of the cafe, you know, other individuals involved, and said, look, we really want to keep this cafe. We want the social housing happen, but, you know, we want to either put the cafe at the bottom of the social housing as a unit where it serves and gives the needs and delivers the needs of the community. This cafe is not just a cafe, no normal cafe. People go there for advice. It addresses the need of many different communities, from Arabs and Somalis. It provides food to the mosque during Ramadan times, provided food parcels during lockdown, and it's really a community space, and it's one of the historic institutions in the area of Butetown. We didn't want to lose it. We didn't want to see it go away and be demolished. But the council had a plan to get rid of it, to implement social housing. Our campaign started with making sure we raise an awareness of this issue. If anybody knows local authorities, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of planning applications that are on their website to read through, and incredibly complex to understand. For us to break that down and tell that story, we had to ensure, look, first, we want social housing. We need to get that out first and foremost. The downfall of any campaign is if people twist it, what you're saying, and make it out to something that you don't want. So we were really clear that we wanted social housing. Number two, we wanted this make sure the significance of the cafe was amplified within the community and within the community of Cardiff, so people are in tune with what's happening. So, we said the cafe is a cultural institution, a historic institution, delivering and serving the needs of the community. So we started getting that out in socials and through people and voices. Now, this was in peak lockdown, so there was no meeting people face to face, no having conversations. And it was very much digital. And it's quite difficult, because lots of the communities are older members of the community who might not have access. So we made sure we amplified their voice and told the story straight away. The next stage that we wanted to raise if you like, turn up the volume in our campaign, raise more noise, is we start to put objections in. As planning process takes place, one of the first things you have to do is get objections from local people about why they don't want social housing there, or why they want the community space cafe to be saved. So we contacted leaders of the mosques, churches, local institutions, local community groups to write letters of support. And we also asked people and community members of prominence, to put objections in, gave them the template, pointed them in the direction where they can interact with the council website, where they can put the objections in. During that last year, that's probably the time where most people, for the first time ever, have ever written an objection to the council. It's quite complicated if you don't know what you're doing. So we tried to break that down. Number two, I think you have to show the strength of your power by getting other institutions to write letters saying this is not just random people shouting, but rather, look, it's a wider community issue. And we want to sit at the table and bring the council forward to have a discussion. Prior to this, the council said they'd done some consultation, and they might have done, but sometimes there isn't a space for that. It's about making sure every community feels represented and voices matter. But we didn't see none of that take place. For months, we were trying to amplify this issue, wrote letters. We got to a stage in October when it was about to go to the planning committee to really amplify the issue. We had press coverage, and lots of people picked up our campaign, started retweeting on social media, sharing on Facebook, sharing on Instagram. We created a video, that was covered by a local press. Now, the pressure was really on the local authority because at that point, they still haven't contacted us or wanted to work with us. So, we made sure that that was amplified. Now, after all that, the council planning committee decided, okay, look, there's too much noise on this. We'll pull it back and decide on this matter later. Still no discussion, still no engagement. But they put the planning application away, and in December of last year, they came back and didn't change the plan and didn't implement the cafe. What happened then is we called out the leader of the Cardiff Council saying, look, you can't offer support to other parts of cultural institutions in Cardiff and not offer it to Butetown. You have to have the same principle applied everywhere. After that point, he finally engaged with us and had a meeting, and it was a productive meeting because we were able to highlight the issues, say, look, we want to work with the local authority. We're not just trying to say we have problems with everything you do. Rather, we want to sit at the table and have a proper and real voice in planning committees and council decisions that affect the community. So I think there are ways in working with the local authority, and for us to do that effectively is making sure, local authorities not only include the community from the beginning, but throughout the journey, they take it with us so that, we can come to that peaceful solution, peaceful problem. Right now, we have really good relationship with the leader of the council, which we hope to build. And, to do that, it only works with both sides being committed to work collaboratively together. I think that's the message I want to leave with, is local authorities are not the enemies or the people that are trying to hurt communities, but rather there are better ways of working, and they just need to recognize and realize there are different voices that can be brought to the table, and we can work together collaboratively to make our communities better. So it's a long campaign, but hopefully it's still going on, and we'll see how it heads in the future, but always try and work with a productive relationship with the local authority. Thank you.
Thanks, Nirushan. That's such a great campaign. I really enjoy hearing about the way that you brought people together and really engage with those processes that, like you say, can be just so kind of difficult. And I feel like, there's kind of a bit of a theme arising here of like, some of these kind of avenues to engage with local authorities that we're usually given being quite technical and requiring quite a lot to engage with. So yeah, really, really appreciate that insight that you brought. Thanks very much. Our last speaker is Rebekah McCabe, who is Senior Project Officer at Involve, which is the UK's leading participation charity that has experience in pretty much all kinds of processes that we have been talking about. Rebekah leads on Involve's work in Northern Ireland, as well as managing and supporting deliberative democracy processes across the UK. And Rebekah's background before coming to Involve was working as a researcher and producer at Northern Ireland's Built Environment Centre, developing programmes to engage the public with issues relating to architecture, planning and land use. So over to you.
Thank you. And just to say, I can, as well as that being a previous part of my career, I'm still an active campaigner on some of those kind of planning issues in Belfast, and I can relate pretty hard to what Nirushan was talking about, and it's so hard and it's so tiring. So so I can see how all of this connects as well, and the ways in which there could be systems in place that don't make it so necessary for people to burn themselves out fighting for to have their voice heard on these issues that affect them. And also we have a Tigers Bay in Belfast. I didn't know there was also one in Cardiff. Anyway, I'll get on with my presentation. So for anybody who doesn't know Involve, we are one of the leading participation charities in the UK, and we have a vision for democracy that puts people at the heart of decision making, and we work on that mission in a lot of different ways, including kind of advocating and making the case for these practices and making sure that people in positions of power understand their uses and their benefits, and embedding good practice. So working with organizations, governments, public agencies to kind of embed the knowledge and skills that they need to be able to sustain participatory practices, and then by doing them. So we're also practitioners, and one of the kind of main things that we're known for, particularly in the last couple of years, is delivering citizens' assemblies across a lot of different scales, nationally and locally. So I've been asked today to give a bit of an overview of how local authorities across the UK are engaging in participatory practices. This is going to be a partial overview because it's coming from the perspective of one organisation, and I really am going to talk a bit about the work that we have done. But I'm going to start also by saying a little bit about some of these terms that we're using, and how Involve approaches them, and the ways that I think they all kind of fit together. So, and then I've got 3 case studies that I'm going to go through quite quickly, just to give a sense of the kind of the range of ways that that local government is both leading on and initiating these participatory projects, but also engaging with them when they're initiated from other places. So first of all, to sort of define the main term that we've been using here, which is participation. It's a broad umbrella term, and it covers a really wide range of practices and approaches. And really what it's about is how people get involved in their communities, and how they influence policies and decisions. And sometimes that's the same thing, and sometimes they are separated out, and they're slightly different. So when we think about participation, then it can be useful to have a framework like this. So these are the fields of participation, and broadly there's 2 fields. So one is activities that are initiated by people who aren't government. So by individuals, by voluntary groups, by civil society and other stakeholders. And that can be at the level of voluntary, individual or social participation. So volunteering for things like doing a litter pick in your local park, coaching a team. So doing things that have a benefit for your community and that give you something back and give other people something back, but isn't necessarily connected into a decision-making process. And then there's public participation that's driven by the public, but that is attempting to connect with a decision-making process. And that's some of the stuff that we've heard about from Nirushan. So campaigns, demonstrations, petitions, citizen audits and other kind of scrutiny mechanisms that are led by the public. And then there's the activities that are initiated by the government, and these are processes that invite people into decision making. So that's everything from your standard kind of consultation right through to delegating decision making power in participatory budgeting, for example. So that's across a whole spectrum of participation. And I guess the point, the important point is that there is a role and a responsibility for government across all fields of this to encourage a participatory culture, to be open, to make sure that there's room in their processes and transparency around what the issues are and how people can influence them if they want to. So the role of the government isn't just to initiate, but they do have a responsibility to be open, supportive and responsive to a healthy civil society. And then in thinking about public participation, there's kind of two drives for, the drive for participation builds on these two principles. The first is that as citizens or as consumers or service users or stakeholders, however we see ourselves, we have a right to influence the decisions that affect our lives. Including how money is spent, how services are designed and rolled out, all of those kinds of things. So that's the first principle. And then the second principle is that involving the people who know what they need and who are likely to be affected by these decisions can lead to better outcomes. And I think Jez's presentation was a perfect example of that as well, that you get multiple good outcomes from just involving people in decision-making processes, but you also get these very specific improvements around efficiency and effective services. The design of public services is going to be much closer to what people actually need than if you didn't involve them in that decision-making process. You have a greater likelihood of successful and effective implementation, and you kind of demonstrate and build that accountability into all your processes. So two other terms then that get used a lot and sometimes get used interchangeably, and I just wanted to spend a moment explaining some of the key differences between them. So there's participation and there's deliberation, and these are sometimes these are individual processes, and sometimes they're talked about as participatory or deliberative systems. But the basic distinction comes down to the types of participant you have, the number of participants you have, and the type of participation that they are doing when they come together. So with the participatory process, you're looking at large numbers of people, and particularly you're looking at trying to create opportunities for people who don't typically engage with political processes to kind of come in. And that's sometimes in a very overt way, trying to bring in people like minorities, like women who have been traditionally excluded from these processes. And sometimes it is just about trying to bring people en masse to get that breadth of perspectives. The way those people come in is that they are self-selected. So people will come in because they want to, because it's a cause that interests them, or there's some other kind of incentive for them to choose to take part. And of course, there are ways that can be encouraged for people who are traditionally marginalized as well. And the goal is for more opportunities for more diverse people to get involved in more aspects of politics. So it's about bringing, it's about a whole diverse range of methods of engagement rather than just one particular method. And then with deliberative democracy, as Andy was saying, it's about a small representative sample, and it's a really small sample actually. So for processes like these, even at the level of the UK population, you're talking about around 100 people. So nowhere near anything that's statistically significant. But the goal is to build a sample that is reflective of the population. And you know, there's kind of many dimensions to that, and I'm going to talk about that in one of my case studies, some of the characteristics that get captured in that representative sample. And the aim with that small size is to achieve a depth of dialogue, so to be able to really get stuck into issues that are very complex, contentious, divisive, you know, whatever, where you really need to get below the surface of what people think as a top of mind opinion. And that's more possible with a smaller group than it is with a large one. The recruitment method is civic lottery, and Andy described in detail what that's like. So people, the general principle is that everyone in a population has an equal chance of getting that initial invitation letter, and then people respond, and from that a representative sample is built. And then the process itself is deliberative. So it's a dialogue that is based on evidence that is balanced and as much as possible impartial, but also bringing in a range of advocates and people with lived experience. So not all the evidence we hear is impartial, because that's not the world we live in, and that's not possible or desirable. But you do hope to have a balance across the spectrum of opinions. And there's time given for participants to weigh all of that up, weigh up what they think, what other people think, and then eventually come to a set of collective recommendations. These definitions are kind of guiding principles, but they're not rules. And actually the case studies that I'm going to go through play around with these a little bit. And it is possible to be creative under certain circumstances about how you kind of, how you work with different types of participant groups and different types of methodologies. But these are, I think, reasonably helpful guidelines to the difference between those two approaches. And just before we go into the case studies, and just because I like doing maps, I decided to map some of the deliberative processes. Well, actually, the citizens' assemblies and juries, which are just two types of deliberative processes that have happened in the UK since 2019. I can see Jez looking, and I probably have missed some, Jez. But Tim, my colleague Tim at Involved, does a fairly good job every 6 months or so of running a tracker on citizens' assemblies and juries. There's been loads. It's unbelievable to me how many there has been. So to put this in personal terms, I started working at Involve in spring of 2018, and at that point, as an organisation, we had done one citizens' assembly. We did two that year, 2018. I went on maternity leave in January 2019 and came back to work in October 2019, and we had done, or were just about to do, 8. So just this massive explosion in 2019 of particularly local governments commissioning these processes. And as Andy said, there's been lots of drivers around that, partly just a growing awareness that these methods exist and are useful. Campaign groups like Extinction Rebellion attaching their kind of campaign asks to this as a process. Local authorities declaring climate emergencies, because a large proportion of these processes that have been mapped were on climate, either explicitly or issues that are related, like congestion and air quality and so on. So yeah, just a massive proliferation of these processes kind of becoming popularized. The orange ones are local, by the way, and the mauve ones are national assemblies. So there's one, the UK-wide one, which I've pinned in London, one in Wales, one in Scotland, and then 2 in Jersey, just because we're working on those right now. So I know it's not the UK. Right. So I don't know how I'm doing on time. I forgot to run my timer.
You are running a bit out of time, so if you want to have another minute to wrap up.
Okay, right. Well, really quickly, I want to run through. I'm going to be very, very quick, Fanny, I promise. So 3 really, really different case studies of processes that use a little bit of the participation model and a little bit of the deliberative model. So MH2K is a youth-led citizen research project that answers the question of what would a mentally healthy place look like. And it engaged with, so it worked across 5 local authority areas with the local authorities themselves as partners in this, but really focused on training up a group of around 20 in each area, citizen researchers, who then went out and ran participatory processes with a wider cohort of hundreds of their peers to decide what actions they wanted their local authority and other stakeholders to take to make their area more mentally healthy. They have an amazing website if anyone wants to look at this, and it's a model that's easily replicated. So I'm not going to say too much because we're running out of time. The second one I want to talk about is so new, it still has a working title and not an official title. But this is the reason I included this is because it's a really good example, I think, of a participatory process that has not been driven by a local authority, but that is working with them as a partner in the process. And this is about what does just transition to net zero look like when it's community led at that very, very hyper local scale. So it's running it as a pilot in 2 areas, the first one being Selby in North Yorkshire, an area that's experienced a lot of deprivation. It's a historical coal mining area, and one of the criteria for selection of a pilot area was to find a community that would be very, very directly impacted by a transition to net zero. And which is also less likely to or unlikely to get involved in that conversation through its own motivation. So so expect to hear more about this. It's very new. I don't even think we have information about it on our website, but it's a partnership between ourselves and Forum for the Future. And then the final one that I want to talk about is Bristol Citizens Assembly, which is just wrapped up. And that is also a good example of using these 2 approaches of participation and deliberation in complement to each other. So it started with a citywide survey to find out attitudes to lockdown, what had changed in people's lives, what did they like about those changes and what didn't they like, and what were their priorities for their future as the city started to think about recovery. So that went out and there were thousands. I think I heard that it was 7 times the number that they normally get to a consultation, which is pretty incredible in its own right. And then based on the responses to that, they convened a citizen. Well, they had always planned to convene a citizens assembly, but they framed the question for the citizens assembly based on the responses to the citywide survey. And that was a 60-person assembly. Recruited through civic lottery. 12,000 letters went out at random across Bristol. You can see on the screen there some of the criteria that were used to stratify that sample. They met over 4 weekends, 30 hours of deliberation, and the oversight structure of that was a steering group and a local advisory group that brought together lots and lots of different interests, particularly underrepresented interests, to make sure that the evidence and the overall shape, the kind of design of the assembly was going to meet the objectives that were set out by the steering group. And this is my last slide. These are just an example of 2 of the recommendations that they made. So there was 3 themes: climate and home. So basically, how do you decarbonize houses in Bristol? Health inequalities, and transport and livable neighbourhoods. And they made 17 recommendations across those 3 topics. And this is just an example. They're really solid, really solid recommendations. All of them are supported by a list of detailed actions and a rationale for how the Assembly came to see this as an important thing for the city to take forward. And if you go to our website or you Google Bristol Citizens Assembly, it'll bring you to the council citizen space, and you can see much more about the the oversight panel, the evidence that they heard, how the whole thing worked. So I'm going to leave it there. Sorry for going over time.
No worries. I think everybody went over time because there's just so much to say about this, but it's not a bad thing that, we've got a lot of experience and expertise in the room and just so much to say about these processes. So thank you all of our speakers. If you want to follow their work more, Steve is just posting all the speakers or the organization's Twitter handles into the chat, and maybe also to say at this point that if you really want to connect with somebody and, for instance, ask for their email address, just drop them private message in the chat, because for GDPR reasons we can't be putting people in touch after the event. But let's just open the floor for questions now. I see there's been quite a few in the chat, and we've got about half an hour left for yeah, just whatever people want to ask and say. Megan, I think you've been monitoring the chat for the questions, so on to you.
I have, yeah, thank you. Those were all so interesting. I wondered if maybe if we start with a couple of questions people have posted in relation to that last talk from Rebekah's, that would be good. Andy Yule, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, which I think you put up in Rebekah's talk, but actually all of the different speakers could respond to.
Yeah, I think it probably applies to all of them. So it originally came up in the talk about participatory budgeting. So the question, so participatory processes, they're all about getting more people's voices heard and bringing in more kinds of knowledge and values and experience and perspectives on issues. But they often kind of pre-frame like issues and ways to participate and what makes a kind of legitimate or valid kind of participation. So what I was wondering about PB in particular was, clearly citizens gain kind of real power by developing the kind of technical and sophisticated understanding of the issues and processes that that Jez was describing in terms of developing shared meanings. But I wondered whether the gaining power in that way, does that limit the ways in which they can bring up or respond to issues that might really matter to them, but that don't get well represented by that kind of technical understanding? Or does it limit their ability to draw a more kind of experiential and less technical sorts of knowledge? So like, while it enables more voices to be heard, but does it limit the way in which those voices can express themselves for the kinds of things that they can express? And so I guess that question would also go widely about participatory processes in general to Rebekah. As I understand, I don't think it does tend to happen particularly in citizens' assemblies, but I'd be interested to hear from Andy on that. And I know it definitely massively happens in planning, but it seems like Nirushan's campaign kind of managed to get around that. So I'd be interested to hear about his take on that as well. I hope that makes sense.
I'll make a brief response if I can, Andy, because you posted it at PB. A lot of these processes are around trying to get away from congestion. So people feeling that they have to beat down the doors of the town hall, that they're feeling blockages, that structure is really hard to access. So the work we do around participatory budgeting, there's two different forms. One's called participatory grant making. So that is small pots of money which are available for citizens to come up with how that money should be spent. And then there's a process where anybody within the community of benefit can actually vote, not just for one project, they have to vote for multiple projects. And through that, people come together and start sharing learning and experiences. When you get into the bigger processes, and bigger sums of money, there's a technical review stage where project ideas that have come from citizens might go through for feasibility, and planners might say, well, you can't have the park there, you can have it here, or the right solution to tackling antisocial behavior isn't that, it might be this. So there's a whole sort of deliberative moment within it. I think that the comment it went, I put it practically in the chat box, it's about the culture of the organisation running these things. If the local authority is open and there is good values and principles, then citizens can raise any topic and talk about it. But I would not say that PB is the only solution to solving all problems. It is one in a toolbox of participatory techniques. It's been proven to be pretty effective in terms of closing that dialogue gap between citizens and experts inside and outside the town hall, and giving everybody a role to play. But I don't think you will ever get one process that is going to answer all of the challenges within our democratic crisis. So I hope that's a start to open a complex question.
It's a really complex question. Is it okay if I come in? Yeah, it's a really complex question, and I think I think it really depends on the purpose of the participation. Like, so if it's participation that is being initiated, if it's in that kind of field, initiated by the government or by some public agency, it really depends on what the purpose is. So with a lot of the deliberative stuff that we're seeing now around citizens' assemblies, they're being commissioned around a very, very specific question. And in fact, we advise, and most people kind of working in this area advise that the question is quite specific. So it shouldn't close down options, but it should frame the issue in quite a precise way, because there is, no matter how long you have, it is still limited. It's still a fixed amount of time for that deliberation to take place. And you really do want to get to the point, and it can be very challenging to get to the point of having recommendations that are kind of practical and make sense. And that's what you want. That's, if you're going to commission a citizens' assembly, that's what you want out at the other side of it, is really concrete, usable recommendations for how to take something forward. And I think a lot of the high profile participation that we're seeing is around that, is kind of feeding into a policy or a strategy. But there's lots and lots of reasons why people do these deliberative processes as well. And that can be around generating new ideas. So it's a really, really open process. I think, we're at the early stages of the Selby work, but that's going to be quite an open process where lots of ideas will be generated without a huge amount of constraint on them. So I think it depends, and I think there's a bias in what gets known about. So you get a lot of publicity around certain types of processes because of the nature of the problem they're trying to solve, so like climate stuff, for example. But there's lots of stuff happening kind of under the radar that is much more open and much more about finding ideas and kind of new approaches to solving old problems that isn't quite so constrained. I don't know if that was some way to answering.
It's kind of starting to, yeah. So I guess the question is really about, so whatever the aim of the project, whether it's initiated by government, whether it's designed to kind of open things up, or whether it's focused on a clear question that you're seeking recommendations to, it's more about what kinds of kind of evidence and knowledge and ways of expressing themselves people are able to bring to that process. So I don't know, thinking about maybe an example would be a low traffic neighborhoods, for example. If there's a process going on, a community wants to develop a low traffic neighborhood, or maybe the council is interested in doing this. Does the process tend to rely on technical data like council air pollution monitoring, or is it are people able to bring stories about school kids having asthma and that kind of more experiential but maybe less technical kind of evidence and support of what they're saying? Does that kind of make sense?
We had that exact topic at the Bristol Citizens Assembly, actually, because one of the strands was livable neighbourhoods, and obviously reducing traffic is the main parts of that. Yeah, you had all of that. So you had traffic studies, you had statistics on air quality, and you also had lots of lived experience. So you heard from disability groups, from older people, from younger people, from parents, advocates who have kind of trialed things. So yeah, you go for mix, and I think Andy will probably have experience from this as well. You really do aim for a mix, and that's the role of the oversight committee as well, is to advise on who to bring in to provide that range of experiences, and and for them to not all complement each other. Everyone's not advocating for the same outcome. So the task of deliberation is to weigh all of that up, all of those kind of different interests and wants, and come out with what is collectively the kind of the best solution.
I'll just quickly chip in there. So I think it's a really important question, Andy. It's really, in order for these processes to be really democratic, they have to cater to lots of different styles of learning, of understanding, of expression. And, there can be sometimes a tendency towards a little sort of academic presentations. And, but yeah, it's really an important design sort of consideration to make sure that, sometimes people like to express themselves with a poem or with some piece of art or something like that. So, I like to be involved in those kind of processes that bring in all kinds of different ways of expression and knowing. Yeah.
And if I can just come in particularly in the participatory grant making mechanism, where citizens stand in front of the audience of everybody and make their presentation about their project idea and talk with passion, what I've noticed is that the people who don't get the money are the people who speak well, who sound like they can get the money from elsewhere. So when you create a structure where people are in a kind of theatre of democracy and people feel that this is about their community, they're very good at spotting people who would otherwise, in our very technocratic and rational processes, not get the money because they can't necessarily kind of fulfill the criteria of what an expert is. But people in those communities can make those decisions. And we kind of work in the PB world on the principle of kind of the knowledge of the crowd, in that sense, that lots of people bringing lots of views to the table and taking part in this process is better than just necessarily a few people with very closed or limited expertise. And I think there's some really interesting bits where we can start to blend these processes. So use sortition to perhaps design the PB process to make sure that it's inclusive to everybody and it responds to different people's point of views. But just to go back to say, you know, Nirushan's video, we've used video presentations as ways that people can communicate. It's very much about communicating passion, as far as I can see, and making democracy live, rather than it being a very stale, structured town hall type of thing.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you.
And Nirushan, did you want to come in on anything relating to that?
I mean, I think what I would say is, I think when approaching how you build voices from the community in, I think it's really important that we do have stories in. I think, you know, all the stuff around data and analysis and things like that are important, but you have to combine that with stories. And, you know, you hit people home and the local authority home with story. I think there was one interaction I had, a councillor came to a meeting. He wasn't the leader of the council, it was someone else. And, you know, they heard a story about a parent talking about issues that they saw with drugs in the area. And you can see them responding so positively and really taking that story in. And, you know, you can see that impact there. The nature of a testimony and a powerful story can go a long way in terms of making that change happen. And I think it's all about how you build that in effectively and, you know, empowering people to tell that story. I think, you know, we don't want key players in communities and, you know, acting like gatekeepers, pushing those narratives out, but rather, you know, you find those people that have something to say and share. And I think it's really important we build that in where we can, when we can. And I think, yeah, it'll go a long way in terms of building up people's contribution to civic society and democracy, but also, you know, issues in communities are only won and heard through stories.
Oh, thank you, Nirushan. Yeah, I really recognise that and feel that strongly. I wonder if we could go to Richard Couldry from Transition Network. Do you want to unmute yourself? You had a question about citizen assemblies and the impact of these processes and the outcomes.
Yeah, I just had to capture that quote from Nirushan. I love it about stories, mate. That's fantastic. So thanks so much for the presentations and the talks. Lots of food for thought. And I really appreciate your time this afternoon. Speakers and organisers, nice one. My question, I think, has developed a little bit. I'm just going to read it to be time efficient. Meaningfulness on citizens' assemblies. What have we seen in terms of the results of citizen assemblies? I appreciate, Rebekah, you shared a link on this. Yeah, what have we seen in terms of the results of citizen assemblies and the validity of reasons for perhaps not taking forward recommendations? And I have a kind of addendum to that question, which is, where does the power lie? I wonder on a macro scale where you feel the power lies, and on a micro scale in terms of when you see the deliberative processes happening.
Yeah, good questions. I was going to mention that same link there. I think the UCL Constitution Unit, they did a study of 13 local citizens' assemblies, and 9 had taken significant steps in responding to the recommendation. I think the OECD had a report as well where they saw that about half of the recommendations that they had been studying were implemented. So yeah, half, I mean, is it good? Glass half empty, glass half full? difficult question there, but I think a lot of recommendations can't, it's difficult, for example, for a local authority to act on certain recommendations because I guess in the UK, government has been so centralized and a lot of powers are centralized, so that for a lot of these issues, they don't have the capacity to act on certain things. So all that they can do for certain aspects or certain recommendations they might receive would be to lobby central government. And yeah, I don't know, there may be other things that come up that may not be, they may not feel are practical. They may not feel that there is enough money for, I mean, the difficult thing within a citizens' assembly is that on the one side, you want them to be aspirational and to really push and to be ambitious and to sort of really push the culture, especially on questions like climate change. Have to be absolutely super ambitious. And then the other side of it, there's the sort of the realism of what a local government feel that they're able to do. So there's a bit of a tension there around all of that. And yeah, it's and also, yeah, it's not easy sometimes for local government to respond to that. They work in quite siloed ways sometimes, and it's not easy to respond to sort of broad recommendations at times. So those could be reasons why they don't respond and carry and implement what the citizens have said.
Thanks, Andy. Does anybody else want to pick up that question?
Well, I'll pick it up a little bit, and I think one of the issues is that it's not always very easy to see the tunnel between the recommendations that come out of the citizens' jury and the decisions that may appear later. So, for example, we did a very small one on the topic of fracking, actually in Preston about 5 years ago, when fracking was a really big issue. And actually, the recommendations were very sensible and basically didn't say fracking is an evil that we need to get rid of, nor we want the jobs, we want the jobs. It made a whole set of recommendations for around how policy could evolve to make sure that residents' well-being was protected, that there was safety controls and all sorts of other things, which have now played out. And now fracking has not been allowed, and the citizens basically came to those conclusions. The problem was it didn't get much press because it didn't fit into that winner takes all, left, right, I'm better, sort of dualism that we have in our society. They were balanced, reasonable. So I think there's a lot of effects which come through, but it's very hard to say, we said and you did, in that very clear, explicit way that we're quite used to wanting to happen, particularly if we're activists and particularly if we have a very strong view about a particular issue. So it's about deliberation, it's about balancing different views, and often quite small hidden things actually lead to quite big shifts later down, but being able to prove the tunnel is not very easy.
I was actually really pleased, Richard, that you sort of took this towards this kind of accountability angle of what happens after, like what's the sort of tension between great recommendations sometimes coming up, but sometimes they're not being the will and sometimes no, but they're not being the resources to implement them. So I was maybe going to, obviously, if you want to comment on Richard's question more directly, go ahead, but I also wanted to ask the speakers a bit about kind of what accountability would look like, or what improved accountability would look like in the context that you've been talking about.
Can I very quickly come back in? And I think Rebekah would echo this, is people who try and facilitate these processes spend a lot of time with the commissioners trying to get them to understand the process and open it up, and also make commitments that they will follow through on those actions. So there's a lot of design work that happens almost before any process starts to make sure that false expectations are not being raised and that there is actually authenticity and meaning behind these processes. I don't know if you've got any more to say on that, Rebekah, to bring that accountability.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of that needs to be agreed at the start. It's almost like that kind of underpinning that underpinning consideration right at the beginning when we're working with the commissioners, to get really clear on the scope and the purpose of the assembly, what is genuinely up for grabs, and for them to be transparent about that at the start. And sometimes what that looks like is a not very ambitious framing. Just to go back to Andy's question, it can look, oh, well, you're constraining this in a way that you just want to get a certain set of questions. But actually, by asking a very specific question and putting those constraints up front, you're getting recommendations that are specific and that are cognizant of real world constraints. So there's a real trade-off there between something that is open and something that is tied to decision-making processes that are kind of already underway. And we do try to agree that at the start. To bring in Fanny's question, some commissioners also build in sort of scrutiny, so that members of the Citizens Assembly will be brought back or will be kind of sustained in some way to check in at certain intervals, 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever, after the recommendations are made, to check against progress by the council. And I know I keep bringing up Bristol because I led on that project and it's just concluded, but I know that Bristol are planning something around that, and other council areas or other local authority areas that we've worked with have done that too. So yeah, sort of smaller standing committees for scrutinising the council's delivery against the recommendations. So I think that's kind of good practice in accountability, and maybe Jez and Andy have other examples too from their work.
Just one example I think is interesting was in France, in the Citizens Convention on Climate. Macron said he would pass all the recommendations without any filter, and when it came down to it, a lot of them were watered down and or not implemented. And the citizens themselves, they formed a group to sort of lobby and to push and to continue to pressure the government on all of those points that come up. So there is that sort of aspect of, there's a potential for citizens to actually continue to campaign on what they've come up with, but it doesn't always happen.
I'll come in on that as well. Another one of our very small cases a number of years ago, which was around food in a very local area. The group afterwards got the support of the local authority to actually go on and set up a food sharing system, a food cooperative for their community, which still exists many years later, and has delivered thousands of meals to poorer members of their community. So if the culture is right and you can open up that dialogue or maintain the dialogue that started, then you can actually enable citizens to take part. And we've seen citizens who've been part of our citizens juries then popping up on forums talking about all sorts of other things. So it's all about giving people senses of agency and voice at the start of the process. But it's not just about then handing it to the authority to do something with. It's about everybody feeling that they've gained agency through these processes.
I think also, in addition to agency, there's a bit of social capital in there as well for people who, especially for people who come into these processes through civic lottery, where they've never been involved in small or big P politics before, and they have no idea how institutions work. Absolutely no idea how decision, and you can't influence things that you don't understand. And I think, for a lot of people, this is their first exposure to even the idea of what policy is. That policy, this big mysterious word that has magical powers. That that this is how it works. Just people making decisions in a room, and it's open to influence in all kinds of ways. And one of the things we've measured with Bristol as well is how people got involved in local decision making before they took part, and how likely they felt they were to get involved as a direct result of taking part. And let me see if I have the statistics, but was it 90% strongly agreed or agreed, and no one disagreed that they would be much more likely to get involved in local decision making processes than they were before, directly as a result of taking part. So the impact isn't just the direct impacts of implementing recommendations. It's also that the impact that it has on individuals and how they become kind of active citizens where they live as well.
Thanks a lot. I actually want to quickly, I've just seen that Jamie, who I was, whose request for, oh no, he's gone. Yeah, there was a request in the chat for resources on what good is like for local authorities, open by default, disclosure and transparency, co-creation as core ethos, from Jamie from Bradford Council. But I think he's had to drop off now. But maybe if you have those resources, do still post them in a chat, and maybe I can then follow up with Jamie afterwards. But yeah, I wanted to ask, yeah, we really only have a couple of minutes left. But Nirushan, I wanted to ask you your take on what we've been talking about, accountability. And
yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, not only because I think accountability is for power holders or local authorities or institutions. I think I put in the chat. It's also on us. I think, sometimes we get in the methodology of looking at what we want to change and really go full on about it and put it forward at asks and think that's job done. In reality, I think there's a lot of onus on us to look at how we have strategies to engage more people and bring in more diverse conversations onto the table. Number two, how we bring solutions rather than issues as well. I think one of the struggles organizers and campaigns have is looking at effective solutions within that chain. Some of these local authorities, some of these policymakers don't know what works and what doesn't. And I think if you, on the community level, on that ground day-to-day basis, are interacting with people and seeing, look, there's a model here that works, there's a solution here that works. It's quite simple, it's quite complex. It's about bringing that to the table and presenting to them. Because every time we met with power holders, they love it when you can present with them, look, a really detailed issue, tell them stories, data, and give them a solution. Look, these are the options for you. So I think there's accountability on you to be running an effective campaign and running different strategies to be able to do that. And for power holders, I think, yeah, it's being transparent throughout each stage. I think if they meet with you, if they come to your assemblies, if they respond to you in a positive way, it's making sure both of you hold each other to account in setting meeting dates and dates that you can review progress. I think one of the key things is always when you have a meeting on a table where there's a power holder, get them to commit to another meeting. That's the first and foremost thing on your agenda. If you don't do that, they'll forget it that you even had this meeting, and 5 months down the line, you're finding it incredibly hard to get a meeting with them, and you're back to ground zero. So always get that meeting. The other thing is, I think it's always important for the local authority or power holders to report back to you and be transparent and honest you can. The way you can do that is, if you have a really good working relationship with them, they will naturally do that. I think the more you communicate, the more that foundation of trust that you build, they'll want to work with you to address these problems. But if that isn't in there, and the relationship's a bit difficult, what we find in our campaign is, making sure we highlight the problems where we see them, when they're not transparent, when there's issues, when there's that way we can hold them to account from the community perspective. Always putting the community's voices at the forefront, so saying, look, you said you're going to do this, but you haven't. That's why we're going to call you out. And it's also always about making sure you hold each other accountable throughout your journey in terms of whatever campaigns or work that you're doing, and making sure community voices are represented. So I think, yeah, it's definitely two ways. I think it's far too easy for us to, get that initial phase and, get that win and get that meeting and say, look, they've agreed, that's great, and pack our stuff and go home and, relax. But reality is all the hard work comes after that. I think, you'll only know what works after going through that process with them for a few months. And yeah, my one advice is, if you don't take anything away from my long little 2-minute speech, is make sure you get a meeting with any power holders you have every time. I think if you want to have a working relationship, you have to get another meeting with them, because nothing ever happens in one meeting. You can get them to agree to things, but that doesn't mean that your campaign or your issues are won. It's won by a longer term working relationship with power holders. So yeah, make sure you get that meeting.
Thanks, Nirushan. That's really powerful, and I think it actually links quite nicely to what Rebekah was saying just before you spoke about kind of how even just people learning about this process and kind of knowing about how things work and sort of what politics and policy is can in itself be sort of really powerful. So I think it really does, yeah, really agree with that sort of kind of two-way thing. I'm really sorry that we are running out of time, and I actually never got to do the like opening it up for for general comments, like I sort of promised in the beginning, but I do think that there's been quite a nice active chat going on in the chat. So yeah, I do want to sort of close to respect people's time, and there will be this recording on our website researchforaction.uk in a couple of weeks' time. I'm not going to immediately be posting it yet, but it's been a really good conversation, and I'm sure that some of the people who registered but couldn't make it on the day or had to leave early will also be delighted to listen back to the recording. So thanks so much for everybody's insight, and yeah, really hope that you've learned. I've certainly learned so much today, and yeah, just wanted to give a quick shout out. If you're interested specifically on the audit and accountability angle of things, please come to our next event of this webinar series, which is on the 7th of June, more specifically on audit reform. Steve's going to post the link in the chat. And next week, we are teaming up with an organization called Municipal Inquiry as part of an international forum called Cities for Change for another event that brings together people working on local democracy initiatives, very sort of grassrootsy kind of people that time. And that's more about sort of what kind of cities and places do we want to imagine and how do we get there. And yeah, Steve, can you also repost the speakers' Twitter handles in the chat once more, just so that people follow these amazing people, and obviously also follow Research for Action on Twitter at @research_act. Steve, you could write that in the chat as well if you may. Thanks so much for everybody's time today. It's been super inspiring and informative, and yeah, do remember to save the chat if you want. It's the bottom right hand sort of corner, those 3 little dots, and yeah, if you want to unmute yourself and come forward to say bye to the screen, Steve can stop recording and we can all just have a little bye and wave at each other.
Hey, thanks so much.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to go get the kids. Are going to run.
Thanks very much.